Welcome to Deep Dive. My name is Jeff Robinson. Welcome to the studio here with the one and only Tony Sanchez. We're so glad to have you joining us in whatever platform that you're using. And it's just you and I today, Tony.
It's just us. Yeah, Pastor Larry, he gets a break today, and we're hoping that while he's out there, we're here. I'm here in this special chair trying to fill some big shoes.
That's true. That's Larry's chair.
That's Larry's chair. So I'm hoping that he's out there somewhere, maybe working on his sock game and getting some really cool socks for next time, because the next deep dive, I'm going to have a big surprise for him that he's not going to expect.
Okay.
So
all right.
We'll see what that looks like.
Well, I don't know what that is either.
I know,
so it'd be a surprise all around. So we do have some big shoes to fit into, to fill with Larry not being here. But for those of you that are aware, a pair of socks were made, I think it was last year, maybe a year before, a Christmas gift, and it was just socks with Larry's face all over. So there's
don't ruin the surprise. That's it.
Larry. Oh, that's it? Are you serious? Wow. Good night. Well, we're on it today. So switching from that, we want to give you guys just an update of some things that are happening here at Grace. We have Friend Day coming up here on Sunday, February 12th. Great opportunity on that day as well. We have baby dedication, so great opportunity to celebrate together with those who are dedicating their babies and inviting our friends. That's also, as we know, hopefully with guys, right, 2 days away from.
That's a very important day that we shouldn't forget. Maybe after our anniversary.
Right. Valentine's Day. And there's a guy who told me after Sunday when we mentioned that, he said, I've been married for 25 years. He said, my wife and I hardly even remember one another's birthdays, much less Valentine's Day. So he just kind of shared that, and you know who you are, brother, and we just pray that this year the Lord gives you a wonderful Valentine's Day ordered extra spicy. All right? So feel free to work through the Song of Psalms there as well. And February 12th is also Super Bowl Sunday, so we're just bringing together some of these different opportunities to invite our friends as we look at God's Word as it relates to friendship, specifically from the book of Daniel. If you're in the area as well, and you've been thinking about being baptized the way that Jesus was, we have beach baptism coming up on February 19th. So, Tony, we're about to talk about the book of Daniel that we're already in process of working our way through. So what we're going to talk about on Friend Day, give us a little bit of a heads up, because Daniel chapter 3 talks about those three friends who took that bold, that uncompromising stand for God, even though, from what it seemed, they were going to lose their lives, right? Be thrown into literally a fiery furnace. So talk us through that account in the scriptures and what we can actually learn from it.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background. There's a lot going on here. Daniel is rich with so much. I mean, not just practical application, but just such incredible stories of these guys that leave everything they've ever known, and then they're put into these positions because they're really upholding the values that they've known for so long. And so we see that they're under the headship of God, and that's who they're going to follow. But they're also in a kingdom that has a king that doesn't follow the God of the Bible. And so we have King Nebuchadnezzar. He's presented here, and we see that he has his dream. And there's this statue, and he doesn't necessarily say this up front, and he wants somebody to tell him, hey, what is going on here with this dream? And somebody's going to figure it out for me, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. And so he's just pretty much telling everyone, just tell me what is going on. And we know that eventually Daniel steps into that role. He tells him what's happening, and then instead of, unfortunately, really having this sense of, wow, this is the true God that maybe I should follow, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, confronted with the God who is in control, tries to take control himself. And so what does he do? He steps into a role that's not his, and he wants to build this statue to show how great he is. And he overlays it with gold. Right, in the prophecy it says, or in the dream it says that that his kingdom is grand, and there's not going to be a kingdom greater than his after that kingdom. And he's this head of gold. And so again, instead of humbling himself, he builds a statue, and he makes it out of gold. He deifies himself, is the way that I'll describe it. And then even though he declares that God is great, it's superficial here in chapter 2, verse 47. And he puts on, I guess, a worship event. Basically, everybody needs to worship me.
So weird.
And worship this statue.
To us today. Like literally, who does that?
I don't know.
I'm going to build a statue of myself.
Yeah.
Cover it in gold.
And
Everybody
everybody's going to
worship
know
that.
it. And I remember as in the past when I've taught history and college level, and I was thinking through sometimes when I've read through the pyramids in Egypt and why the pyramids were built. And a lot of historians believe that because Egypt was so easily defendable on different areas because of the way it's located, the pharaohs, who a lot of them believed they were godlike, had to have a reason for people to believe and worship in them. So the pyramids and many other things were built in order to say, I'm great and this is why. And they build these pyramids. And so maybe this is what he thought. Nebuchadnezzar thought, I'm going to build something to show that I'm great. And he built this statue. But the point is, here's a central theme I think that I've seen here. I mean, definitely we see this. We're going to see this sense of friendship, and these guys are hanging together with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they go against King Nebuchadnezzar. And the central theme that you see has to do with what we worship. I mean, there are a ton of people in Babylon right now. It's not just Babylonians. I'm sure there were other Jewish people that came that were in exile, and they probably bowed down too, because they were afraid of the consequences. But these guys decide not to, and unfortunately, the king finds out about this and brings them in, questions them, and he even gives them a second chance. And he gives them a warning, and he tells them this in chapter 3 of Daniel. He says to them, verse 15, if you don't worship, you shall immediately be cast into a fiery furnace or a furnace of blazing fire. And then he questions them. He says, who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands, or who will rescue you from my power? So he basically telling them, choose wisely, because it's either you're going to obey the king's orders or just some God that you say you believe in. So again, there's so much to the story, Pastor Jeff, and you know that, but they still decide not to bow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to take a stand, but then to take that stand a second time. And I love what they say. They replied to him, we do not need to give you a reply concerning this. Man, bold words to say to somebody in charge of a large kingdom who's in control. If our God whom we are serving exists, he is able to rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will rescue us, O king, from your power as well. So there it is. This is what we're going to do. We're declaring it no matter what you say to us, no matter how many times you're telling us that we need to either do this or we'll die. But, verse 18, if not, let it be known to you that we don't serve your gods, and we will not pay homage to the golden statue that you have erected. And then what happens after that, Pastor Jeff? What happens to these guys when they tell him that?
Straight up thrown in.
Yep, thrown into the furnace, and that was it, right? They were gone.
Break it down.
No, they weren't. So somehow they lived, and King Nebuchadnezzar's there, and he sees that there's a fourth character in there. Right? Some scholars say it could have been Christ in there with them or some angel, but these guys live. They're taken out of the furnace, and again, Nebuchadnezzar sees this great act of God, first through the dream, and then them not bowing down to this statue. So there's so much we could say, incredible story, but here's some application that I see, hopefully, that I believe you can connect. In the same way that they were presented with this issue or this opportunity to say, either you're going to obey what I say and not follow your conviction, specifically if you're a Christian, what we worship is going to lead to our actions. That's just the way it is. Like, how do we live our lives, right? But what does that look like? And our society, the society we live in and the culture around us can lead us to do things on a whim or impulsively. We see that all the time, not just in the days of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and in this book, in the Bible, but even today. And here are some examples. The first is, how do we spend our money? I think that's something that it's so easy to be impulsive and spend it on unnecessary things, right? We've all heard of bargain shopping. We all love that when we believe we're getting a deal. Here's some famous ones that we know about: Black Friday, Cyber Monday, BOGO, or one of my favorites during Christmas, December to Remember by Lexus. I don't know if you've ever seen those commercials, right? That's a really catchy one, right? I'm going to go out and I'm probably not going to buy a Lexus because of that slogan. But so here's my one advice here for this first point, all right? When you go out shopping, maybe you should make a shopping list, because if not, you're going to just fall prey into unnecessary spending. Here's the other one. This is a big one too, social media. Some people post then think. That's a big one, all right? And if you don't believe me, go ahead and download Twitter and go on Twitter so you can see some of the stuff on there that can be very uplifting, but most things are probably not. So that's just a big part of it. So some people do that. So how we spend our money, social media. And then here's another one. Think about children. Probably the most impulsive human beings in the world, right? I mean, they interrupt conversations. They can pout and complain. They get upset over sharing. And you know this because you have young children. I'm sure you've seen this. Even as much as we try to tell them not to do that, they're impatient. Or one of my favorite ones that I thought of is they just get into dangerous situations without even realizing it. Right? They jump off couches. They just think, I'm just going to do whatever I'm going to do to have a good time. And here's an illustration that I want to give you, a personal one. I remember when I was a child, I still remember like it was yesterday, I would purposely try to sneak out of my grandma's house to climb trees. And then once I would climb the trees and she didn't know where I was, I'd try to get her attention and she would come out
Breaking Bad.
and flip out. And then I'd be up on the top of the tree just waving at her. And then she didn't know how she was going to get me down, so she was just hoping that her young grandchild would get down without breaking a leg. And so I still remember that, and so many other stories that I can share. But ultimately, the final thing I'll say is, like, what's your track record regarding impulsive split-second decisions? Or another way to put it is maybe think about what are your idols. We can all fall prey to this. And I love what one commentator says. He says this: the fact is, many idols are good things when properly viewed and used, but when a good thing becomes a God thing, it then becomes a bad thing. It becomes an idol. So our decisions line up with who we are, and the way that we behave really reflects our character, the decisions that we make, and those that we surround ourselves with will influence our decisions. One of the things that I love about this story in this chapter is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like, they stuck together. Like, not one of them budged. It's not as if one tried to save the other by putting the other one out front. Like, they stuck together. They obviously had a great friendship. Not only did they believe in the God of the Bible, but they also stuck together, and they had this close friendship because of it, and they were willing to go down with the ship. So I really love that. So the final thing I'll say is that what we worship will not only impact how we act, but it's going to impact the decisions that we make, and those decisions are going to say a lot and impact us for a long time. So that's what I'll say about that, and I'll send it on over to you, Pastor Jeff, because I know there's a lot there, and we want to cover a lot because there's a lot here. So here's my question to you. In Daniel 4, in the very next chapter, Daniel, he uses the gift, right? He's obedient to God, and he uses the gift God gave him to interpret dreams, right? Something incredible that we read about. And he interprets this troubling dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has. And we know that he's a very short temper. So tell us about Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, which we've already mentioned a little bit, that dream, and what we can apply to our lives from Daniel chapter 4.
Well, Tony, I love how you broke down what you did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those three guys that were there together. And I just can't wait to get to Friend Day. It's going to be a fun time. We're gonna look at, there's just so much there in that chapter that a lot of songs, Christian songs, have been based on, and preachers, he's in the fire with you. Like, there's a lot going on there. But in Daniel chapter 4, we see another angle to King Nebuchadnezzar. Like you mentioned, he's a guy who apparently has a complex to where he's struggling with this actual belief in his own mind and heart that he could possibly be God. I know we've all either played pickup basketball with a guy who thinks that he's MJ, or we've worked in different work contexts where there's certain people you're like, they really think they're good, like better than, and they think that they're the stuff, right? And we can pick up on some of these cues, but for those of us specifically who are living in this period of history, and those of us who live in somewhat of a Western context, to try to, and I don't think we fully can, but to like get somewhere in the mind of an ancient king of Chaldea, of Babylon, and you, like, there is no rival. You are in control of Babylon itself. Just some facts on Babylon. Procession Street was 62 feet wide, and it was paved with imported stone, and it was called, the translation, "The enemy shall never pass." And man, there's some fascinating facts that we know today. And by the way, this is not something, if you're new to the Bible, that is just like relegated to the pages of Scripture. We literally know where Babylon was. Like, it has been excavated. We know there's studies going on. It's in modern day Iraq. And this guy was the king of so many provinces. He's the head of so many military victories. So, like, you can kind of think about it in terms of whenever we win a game, or whenever we may win professionally or financially today on any level. It doesn't even have to be something huge or that makes the news. We all know that little inside feeling of pride. Like, yeah, I did that. Magnify that to like a trillion-fold, and we may get a little bit of a glimpse of what Nebuchadnezzar was having to struggle with, because the dude was insanely successful. But there in chapter 4, he has this dream. He goes, right, Daniel's going to interpret that dream for him. We're going to get into some of those details there in the message. But he kind of just pushes that off, and he has this moment where he's saying, as he looks at Babylon, look at what I've created, look what I've done, basically saying out loud what he had been struggling with or even processing for a long time in his heart, that I did all this, there is no one above me, my success is my success, and look what I've done. At this point in time, there's nobody on the planet who is as accomplished as I am. And it's like God in his mercy gives Nebuchadnezzar the mind of a beast. So like for 7 years, he was out in the fields. It's hard for us to understand, but like he ate grass like an ox, completely humiliated, completely humbled by God. But I think back to Daniel working and living in that context. Daniel was an ethnic minority. He had no voting rights. He had no ability to really do what he wanted with his life. He was somebody who had been forcibly abducted as probably a really young person by a foreign empire, different people, different ethno-linguistic group, and he was like indoctrinated with the Babylonian way of thinking that was not based upon God's word. But one thing that I remember specifically in Daniel chapter 4 is that Daniel didn't seem to be intimidated by power. It's natural for every single one of us, whether we meet a person who has a lot of economic power, a lot of education, or maybe even a famous person. Like, I've met a couple of famous people before. I remember I met several years ago, Evander Holyfield, in this little restaurant. And man, I had a picture. I said, can I get a picture with you? He's a super nice guy. He said, sure, no problem. And the guy, who happens to be my brother, his phone didn't have enough space. This is like way back in the 1800s, right? And he's like, I'm sorry, I got to delete a picture. And I'm like, I'm here with Evander. And like, he was just so cool, so kind, great guy. But man, I still remember my pulse started to race. And it wasn't like he was going to, knock me out. You didn't think I was Mike Tyson part, whatever. But we all have probably been in a situation to where we've been a little bit of shock and awe by where we are, maybe a super nice place, or people who have a lot of power and a lot of knowledge. But Daniel, he may have been shocked, he may have been intimidated initially, but he did not allow the fear of man, which is a snare, Proverbs 29:25, to take over his mind. He allowed Proverbs 1 verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Again, he had no rights. He had no ability to save himself in terms of pull a Chuck Norris and, take out all the Babylonian guards. He had only his trust in the Lord. So that just really encourages me that he was able to speak the truth with respect for authority. And man, Nebuchadnezzar, you're not talking about a guy who was democratically elected and a republic that is based upon the rule of law. You're talking about an ancient Near Eastern despot, a tyrant. So far from a perfect authority, even in that context, I'm just so challenged by Daniel because he still showed respect for that authority. Even though the authority was a megalomaniac, even though he was corrupt, even though he was a pagan, Daniel still exercised this truth, but apparently he had the tone and the respect. I'm also challenged there in chapter 4 by Daniel. Apparently, man, he had really put himself into his studies. He became actually skilled and good at what he did. And for those of us today, we don't live in a Babylonian context in terms of the structure, but our culture seems to be increasingly embracing the sexual perversion, the lust for power, the idea that the more money I get, the more successful I am, and the point of life is to dominate and accumulate, right? But in Daniel's day, his skill provided him a platform. So whether you're watching this and you're a high school student, college student, young adult, whether you are retired, whatever season you are in your life, or if you are a new empty nester and you're really sad about that, or if you're a new empty nester and you just can't keep praising the Lord, say, thank you, Jesus, right? Take the wheel, take the kids, take them out of my house. Whatever season of life you're in, we can all exercise our skill in whatever, even if it's like just a passion and a hobby. If you become good at that, you can have a voice either in those gatherings or whether you have a presence online, and that will give you the opportunity to influence people for Jesus Christ. And so I would say that to say this, that gaining favor and influence is not impossible in Babylon itself. And I think for some of us that are committed Christians, we can see sort of the way that the world is trending, or certain things that are happening in our own country, or the way that people's thinking is being changed on a lot of really serious issues. Even to where there's conversations today about pedophilia and how we maybe should change the law relating to that. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with being a pedophile. Like, these are arguments that are now being posited on the world stage. And so we see that and we're troubled by that. And sometimes we can come to the conclusion, I think, of saying, well, the world is broken and seems like the world's kind of headed to hell in a handbasket. So there's no way for me to really, influence, and I'm against the world. But man, we see throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament, godly men and women that are in places that God has ordained for them to be in, and they don't give up. They don't just say, well, there's no way I can ever influence this. Man, if you are still breathing, God has you where you are. He's given you the passion and the skill set that you have so that you can influence wherever you are. Don't ever come to the conclusion, if you're a follower of Christ, that just because you live in like a really, really corrupt place, or a neighborhood, a city, a region, or even a state, that even in terms of its laws has just given both fingers to God and His Word and basic natural law. Don't think because of that. Don't think because you're in Babylon that you can't influence, because we have an entire book of a guy who was in Babylon and who made it through. And this is a great, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that's real good, because I think a lot of people are definitely in need, and they need to hear this, because being in a place like South Florida, it can feel like we are in Babylon in a lot of ways. And in many ways, I mean, this is just a reality. We are. I mean, you just drive our local area. There are just take a trip to the beach. There are billboards that that let you know that there's an openness here in our context that even still in many places in just this country, you're not going to see it on the billboard. It may still be in the town, but it's not going to be celebrated like it is here. Right. But because Christ is in us, we don't want to say, well, anathema and it's all going to hell, so we don't worry about it. No, God has placed us here to love people and to point them to the truth that Christ can change anyone. Before we flip it back to you, Tony, this is a great book. I haven't made it all the way through. It's called Pride and Humility at War, A Biblical Perspective by J. Lanier Burns. And there's some commentary in here on this chapter in the book of Daniel. It's fascinating stuff. But the summary here is that Nebuchadnezzar illustrated a mighty king who was transformed from persecutor of God's people to proclaimer of God's dominion over the earth. And the way that chapter finishes is when God gives Nebuchadnezzar back his mind, like his right mind. Man, he just repents, and he admits that in verse 37 of chapter 4, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, who do you think he's talking about? Himself. Yep. He is able to humble. And we're not exactly sure if those are the last words of Nebuchadnezzar, but boy, what a beautiful story of a guy who thought he was the stuff,
who realized through God's mercy in taking away even his mental faculties for a time, that was God's mercy in pursuing even Nebuchadnezzar. So I say this before we flip back over, that if you're a Christian that struggles with kind of like giving up on your local culture, your city, your neighborhood, or even people, just remember that God pursued personally Nebuchadnezzar himself. God loved Nebuchadnezzar enough to not just say, you know what, I'm God, you're not, you think you're me, boom. God gave what seemed to be like judgment, but it was actually mercy to humble Nebuchadnezzar, because God even loved Nebuchadnezzar. So that challenges me
Absolutely.
like crazy throughout the book of Daniel.
And he pursued you and I.
Absolutely, 100%. So this is really fun. Daniel chapter 5, some of us have heard the phrase, the handwriting on the wall. That's where this comes from. If you don't come from a Bible background, or if Christianity is new to you, we'll unpack this. But often it refers to like a warning of upcoming misfortune. So Tony, walk us through the handwriting on the wall, Daniel chapter 5, and what we're supposed to do with that.
Yeah, and it's one of those stories that you can read and think, this is a horror novel I'm reading here.
No doubt.
In this area, and
No
so
doubt.
and you start reading it, and you're like, I think I'm reading about the Addams family here when you read this chapter. But we see King Belshazzar, which is the son of King Nebuchadnezzar here, and one of the first things I think of is, man, the son didn't learn from the mistakes of the father, and the way Nebuchadnezzar took so much to humble him, the way that you just mentioned, right? He has these dreams of a statue, he builds this idol like we mentioned, and then he's humbled and brought low like a beast, and then what does his son do? Makes probably an even worse mistake, and he goes in and he wants to have this sacrilegious party, takes these items from God's temple when it was in Jerusalem, and they took those items with them, and they just start worshiping these false gods, right, of silver and gold and wood and stone and all these different things. And Daniel tells him that he went against the Lord of heaven. And why does he tell him that? Because all of a sudden we see this divine graffiti on the wall, right? Right when he does this with all these guests to show that he's so grand, God comes out and he writes these words that nobody can translate but Daniel. And Daniel reminded him of his father's own humbling experience. And there in verses 22 of chapter 5, he says that he didn't humble his heart, even though he knew everything that his father had experienced. And I thought that was, imagine he was already nervous. You see in the story that he is so nervous when he sees God perform this act. It says his knees are knocking. Okay, so he is just spooked. And then Daniel tells him, you should have known better. And I think just like we have this statement that, the handwriting on the wall, another statement that we're very familiar with is that history tends to repeat itself. And we see that here with Belshazzar, and so it's just a really sad way to know that these dreams and these experiences that are happening, and God tells King Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom is great, but it's going to fall. And how fast it does fall here we see with his son. And after interpreting the dream that night, Belshazzar is killed and he dies. And what happens? Darius the Mede comes in and he takes over the kingdom, and there's the end of Babylonian kingdom. It's gone. That's it. The Medes and the Persians come in, and it's that next part of this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, that his kingdom would end and these new kingdoms would rise up. And so that's just a little bit of what I see. What are your thoughts, Pastor Jeff, there in that chapter?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story, and I do think you can make a case for this is, and so for some of us this is very, very twisted seeming, but like it's a horrifying reality, like an actual hand, like it's not CGI, it's not special effects. And all of a sudden, man, and many tekel and parson, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Like if you just had, I don't know, like William Shatner or somebody, or Morgan Freeman, just say that like really slow and get some music underneath.
I'm thinking like Liam Neeson.
Hey, that too.
I'd watch that.
That too. Or just straight up bring Chuck Norris in, right, and just have him execute the penalty. But I thought too, and what's interesting is in this day and time, like a son or a grandson was they were both considered to be sons of. That's like an ancient Near Eastern way of doing it. So just like in Israel, we are sons of Abraham. And so you got some commentaries say this is maybe 20 years later or so between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. But you have this situation of strong men, and this is also repeated throughout history, we know, that can have a tendency to have, not always, but if there's not a really concerted effort to pass down what made those men great in terms of their character, in terms of work ethic, in terms of determination, strong men can have weak sons and weaker grandsons. And we even see this with wealth transfer in this country in this time period, that often first generation wealth, if they're the first generation who actually gained it, they're the ones who had to put in the work. Like they're the ones who had to grow the empire. Second generation, the kids, they grew up with it. So there's not the same level of tenacity. Again, that's not a universal concept, but we do see some trends towards that. And we also see with Nebuchadnezzar, like he actually did, end of chapter 4, he was leaning towards God. And what he said about God humbling those who are prideful, that's hugely informative of Nebuchadnezzar's heart towards the end as it related to God. But we don't have any evidence that Belshazzar ever paid attention to that. He was somebody that had been born into opulence and actual, like in that context, privilege with a capital P.
Absolutely.
And you see how there was such a disrespect even, because they're pitching the incredible party. There's a war going on. Like literally the Medes and the Persians did not just teleport there. They were actively warring against Babylon, and he's going to throw a party. So we see in that, at bare minimum, his refusal to assume responsibility. He should have been leading, but instead he was partying. And we see that even in that, it's like, well, let's have a party and let's go get all of the vessels that had been stolen from the temple there in Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar's leadership. Like just an extreme disrespect for no reason whatsoever. And with that, I'll close with this. I think it's so ironic, Tony, that you've got Daniel, right? Forcibly abducted as probably a really young person from his home by this godless Babylonian Empire. Babylonian Empire, when they pulled him away from everything he had ever known, that's after they defeated the city of Jerusalem. That's after they burned Solomon's temple, like the original temple, burned it to the ground. Incredible sacrilege. I imagine in his world as a really young guy, and he's forcibly indoctrinated with this Babylonian worldview that's corrupt, that's perverse. But it looks like Babylon, nothing could ever shake the foundations of that city. But in God's providence, God allowed Daniel, this to me like crazy ironic, allowed Daniel to live long enough to see Babylon fall. That still just gives me chills. Like what would that be like? And you're the one that they call to come in and say, hey, something just happened. And everybody's freaked out, even though they're blasted drunk. That's another thing. Like if you're that scared and you're that drunk, you're like really freaked out. And he's the one who actually gets to read what's on the wall, that is God's word of judgment upon everybody there. It's kind of like God says, here you go, you get to drop the hammer, right? But he is able to live that long to experience in his own life that there is one king who is above all, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and nothing can shake his kingdom. And so it's just a really awesome book. And again, especially for those of us that are maybe in school or we're involved in business, for-profit, non-profit, doesn't matter. We do see in many ways that we are, in some sense, living in Babylon. So we find powerful truths from God's Word that will give us the ability to know how to navigate through so much of that. So thanks again, Tony, for being here.
A lot of fun.
And it's always great to have a conversation with you and to serve with you here at Grace. Tony's our connections pastor here at Grace, helping people be connected to the ministry of the church and also being connected within small groups. You do such a great job with that. Appreciate you, respect you, love you. And Larry, we miss you, brother. We look forward to seeing you here back next time. And so thank you for being here with us at Deep Dive. Tony Sanchez, Jeff Robinson, signing off in the studio. We'll see you this Sunday, 8:30, 10, or 11:30 a.m. in person or online.